as kings go. Hezekiah, king of Judah, was a pretty good one. Oh, he lived through some hard times. Times of great change and threat. Why, in his days, the entire region was invaded by the armies of the emperor of Assyria. They laid waste everywhere. The entire kingdom of Israel to the north was completely wiped off the map. And Hezekiah's own kingdom of Judah came this close to destruction. But they survived. And thanks to Hezekiah, they not only survived, they thrived. Hezekiah led them boldly and well. He reformed the religion of the people, banned the worship of foreign gods, shut down the high places that were dedicated them. And in Hezekiah's day, perhaps for the first time ever, all of God's people from everywhere came together to celebrate a glorious Passover in the city of Jerusalem at the temple. All in all, a pretty good king. Except for one thing. One thing he got wrong. As we read this morning, Hezekiah got very sick. Everyone thought he was going to die, but somehow, with God's help, he recovered, and afterwards, he had some visitors. Some diplomats came to pay him a visit from a far-off city called Babylon. Hezekiah had never heard of Babylon, knew nothing about it. But he welcomed these ambassadors graciously. He let them tour his house, the temple of the Lord, even his treasury and storerooms. Showed them everything. The Babylonians were very impressed. But once the Babylonians had left, Hezekiah received another visitor. It was the prophet Isaiah. And Isaiah was livid. He was angry. He was angry probably because Isaiah understood a little bit more about international affairs than the king did. And he knew that Babylon was not just some city far away. He knew that it was an empire on the rise. And that within a generation, the empire of Assyria would be gone and Babylon would be sending out its armies to conquer the world. So Isaiah came in and he angrily announced to the king that he had done the wrong thing by showing all his treasures to these Babylonians. And he warned him, days are coming, he said, when everything in your house, everything that has been stored up by your ancestors will be carried off into Babylon. This is the word of the Lord, Isaiah said. And I don't know, I think maybe Isaiah was maybe a bit harsh with him. Because what did Hezekiah do? He was just a good diplomat. He welcomed visitors, showed them around. Why should Isaiah be so angry? It's not fair. And it seems unfair until you read Hezekiah's response. For when Hezekiah hears this, hears it announced by the prophet that his entire kingdom, everything he's worked for, everything he's built, will be destroyed. His own children carried off into exile. All that Hezekiah can say in response is this: the word of the Lord that you have spoken is good. Good? Good. Can you imagine that? How can anyone have that attitude? Well, the only reason why Hezekiah can say that apparently is because he thinks to himself, I mean, especially someone like Hezekiah, when you've worked for something, and you've sacrificed for it, and you've seen it through the good times and the bad, how can you not be concerned whether or not that thing continues on after you're gone? How can you say, why not? So long as there is peace and security in my days. Well, Hezekiah said it. But surely he's unique. Surely no one else could possibly ever think like that. I did not go to the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Canada this year. It wasn't my turn. We clergy, we only get to go maybe every 5 or 6 years. But I heard reports. I heard about some of the discussion that took place there. My friends reported back to me, in particular, that there was a group of people there. Ministers, clergy, who were heading for retirement. And they knew that this would be the last assembly they would ever have to attend. And my friends reported back to me that there was a certain attitude among that group. It was easily detectable. They simply had no interest. Were inclined to give no attention, no energy to anything beyond what was going to happen in the church for the next few years. Now, of course, some of them were very subtle about this, just quietly pushing the discussion in other directions. But others, as the church discussed where it is, where it needs to go, they were anything but subtle. One or two got up and announced to the whole assembly that they would not allow us to think or discuss or study anything beyond the next few years. Now, I hardly mean to suggest that all ministers reaching retirement are going to have that kind of attitude. I'm quite sure it is rare. But the fact that it's there at all, that there's even one or two who have such an attitude towards the church, is perplexing. How can you do that? I mean, when you've worked for something and you've sacrificed for something and seen it through the good times and the bad, as all church leaders have done, how can you possibly not be concerned about what happens to it simply because you're not going to be around anymore? And yet the attitude seemed to be, why not? So long as there is peace and security in my days. I call it the Hezekiah Syndrome. And I think it is definitely present in the church in our days, and not merely among the clergy heading for retirement. I mean, to a certain extent, maybe that is understandable. I hate to be the one to break this to you, but actually, ministers, members of the clergy, we're human, like everyone else. And like anyone else, as we approach that retirement mark, there's a tendency to be tired, maybe even burnt out. There is that tendency to begin to focus on the next stage of your life. But to think that the only thing that really matters is the health of that pension plan. So actually, I think it's not too surprising that the attitude does come up. It would take someone of extraordinary vision and focus not to fall into some of the symptoms of the Hezekiah Syndrome. And thank God we do have some people with that kind of vision and that kind of focus. But yes, I will stand here on behalf of all the clergy, confess to you that we do suffer from the Hezekiah Syndrome. It does affect us from time to time. But here's the thing, we're not the only ones. And I believe that in fact the Hezekiah Syndrome has spread far and wide in the church. It has even affected the laity. May I ask you a question? Have you ever heard this phrase in a church? Has anyone ever said this to you? We've always done it this way. Maybe you haven't come across it. I've heard it a time or two. Well, let me tell you, there's nothing wrong with we've always done it this way. At least if this way is still working, still connecting with people, still touching people's lives. I'm a big fan of how we've always done things, so long as it's still working. But the reality is, of course, that things change, and people change, and society changes, and sometimes the things that we've always done don't really work so well anymore. And we begin to have to devote more energy and resources just to keep them going, and the returns, in terms of the growth of the kingdom of heaven, get less and less. But the real test comes when that's happening. When there's the things that we've always done just don't seem to be working so well anymore, and someone stands up and says, well, you know what, maybe we shouldn't do it anymore there. Or maybe we should change it significantly. And at that point, what happens often is this: people start calculating, and people start bargaining. And they'll say, okay, yeah, maybe it's not working like it used to do, but you know what? If we work really hard and put in extra resources and throw some extra money at it, we can keep it going for a few more years. And the thought underneath that, behind that, is surely this: and then I won't have to deal with the change. Why not? So long as there is peace and security in my day. Sometimes in churches, conflict develops. You have a group of people over here, people over here, who, think things should be done this way. You have people over there who think things should be done that way. They don't agree. They begin to clash. They begin to butt heads. It's the kind of thing that always happens whenever you have people who feel passionately about what they're doing. There's going to be some conflict. But when that conflict develops underneath the surface, it creates a bit of a crisis, because so long as it's there and so long as it's roiling underneath things, it begins to infect everything the church does, and the church can't get by, it's kind of stuck. So long as it's under the surface, until it's brought out into the open and dealt with constructively. But you see, we don't like that. Nobody wants to deal with the conflict, and so we often prefer to just keep it under the ground. And yeah, we'll placate this group and that group from time to time, keep them from getting so angry that they boil over, keep the conflict from coming out in the open. So we don't have to deal with it. Sometimes we fight proxy battles instead. We fight over the color of the paint on the wall, or the positioning of the furniture, because that's better than fighting over the things that really matter. Like hurt feelings, like regret for a lost past, like competing visions. But at all costs, we keep that real conflict from coming out. Why? Because we don't want to deal with it, and maybe if we put it off, it'll be somebody else's problem someday. Why not? So long as there is peace and security in my day. The Hezekiah Syndrome is alive and well in the Church of Ireland. It's a big problem because, of course, you see, Isaiah was absolutely right. He was absolutely right about his predictions. The kingdom of Babylon did arise, and it went on to conquer the whole world. And within a generation, the kingdom that Hezekiah had built up and sacrificed for was destroyed by the armies of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And all his treasures carried away, his own sons enslaved. Sometimes when all you can see is security in your own day, that's all you get. Now, of course, the good news is that that's not the end of the story of God's faithfulness and commitment to his people. Even after the disaster of Babylon, God found a way to bring his people back, to create hope, to create a new beginning. But here's the thing. Hezekiah and Hezekiah's heirs had no part in making that happen. They were relegated to nothing of importance. Why? Because I think Hezekiah himself failed to have that vision to see beyond the needs, the peace, and the security of his own day. In the same way, I'm not concerned at all about the future of the Christian project. I'm not concerned about the future of the message we proclaim, because God's commitment to the church is unchangeable. No matter what, there will always there'll be change. There'll be much adaptation in years to come. But no matter what, there will always be a church there to proclaim a message of hope, to build towards the kingdom of God, even here on earth. But here's the kicker. We and our spiritual heirs may have no part in that. If we cannot raise our eyes and think beyond the peace and security of our own day. That's the danger. The Hezekiah Syndrome is deadly. The good news is there is a treatment. Some even say a cure. The Apostle Paul knew it. It had to do with an attitude. He felt the same pull as everyone does towards that attitude of seeking only for peace and security in your own time, but he fought it with this. This one thing I do, he said to the Philippians, this one thing I do, forgetting what lies before, stretching towards what is ahead, I press on toward the goal and the prize of Christ calling me heavenward. And with that attitude, Paul inspired the church of his generation. He created a church in many ways that changed the makeup of the entire world for thousands of years to come. We face the same challenge. We are facing perhaps change as significant as anything that Paul went through. What could we put in place? If only we could forget what lies behind and stretch towards what is ahead. Beyond the peace and the security of our own day. We take a few moments in silence.